She only meant to vanish into a stranger's shadow for 10 seconds. Delphine Marsh grabbed the tall man waiting alone in a dim hotel corridor and kissed him like her life depended on it, because in that instant it did. She had no way of knowing the mouth she'd claimed to hide her face belonged to the most feared Don on the Florida coast, a man who would spend the next 3 days turning Miami inside out looking for the curvy stranger who'd dared to use him as a shield and who had no intention of ever letting her disappear again. The ballroom of the Windemere Hotel glittered over Biscayne Bay, all chandeliers and champagne, and the particular loud laughter of people who wanted to be seen laughing. Delphine stood near a marble column with a glass of Prosecco she hadn't touched, her thumb tracing the seam of her burgundy gown where the tailor had pinned it that afternoon until it fit her, like it had been poured onto her. She was 29, a senior forensic accountant at Calder Reyes Maritime, and she had spent 4 straight nights untangling a client's shipping ledgers before this gala had even crossed her calendar. Tonight, for once, she had looked in the mirror and liked the woman looking back. She was curvy, unapologetically so, and the gown did exactly what she'd asked it to do. It didn't apologize for her either. Her hips filled the silk the way they were built to. Her arms were bare and strong. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like herself, instead of a smaller, quieter version of herself. That fragile confidence lasted exactly as long as it took her to see him across the room. Weston Cole, her ex-fiancé, a man who had spent 3 years dismantling her from the inside with a smile on his face the whole time. Weston worked mid-tier corporate lending, and he had a talent for making cruelty sound like concern. He counted her plate at dinner, called her curves a health problem he was worried about, and told her again and again that a woman built like her should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. Leaving him had been the single hardest thing Delphine had ever done, harder even than the night he'd put his fist through their bedroom wall 6 inches from her head. And now somehow impossibly he was here, in a city he had no business being in, his eyes locking onto her across a room full of strangers, with the same sick, hungry recognition of a man who'd found something he'd misplaced. 2 hours earlier, before any of it, Delphine had walked into that ballroom on her own 2 feet, chin level, because the version of her that used to hover near exit signs at every party had finally started to lose ground to the version that had spent 5 years clawing her way to senior accountant, while men twice her age assumed the curvy woman with the calculator was somebody's assistant. She had corrected that assumption enough times to stop counting. She liked her job, liked the particular satisfaction of finding the one wrong decimal buried in 40 pages of freight invoices. Liked that Calder Reyes trusted her with the accounts nobody else wanted to touch. She had told herself, walking in tonight, that she deserved to enjoy one evening without shrinking. Seeing Weston across the room had undone 5 years of that work in about 4 seconds. He set his drink down. He started toward her. Delphine's pulse spiked so hard she felt it in her teeth, and every rehearsed calm response she'd practiced with her therapist evaporated on contact. She turned and moved, weaving through a cluster of executives who barely noticed her, her heels sinking into thick carpet as she pushed through a set of heavy doors into a corridor that led toward the hotel's private suites. The music dropped away behind her. The hallway was dim, lined with gold sconces, and empty, except for one tall figure standing with his back to her near the far end, studying a painting as though the gala noise didn't exist for him. We post a new story like this every single day, so subscribe now and don't miss it. Footsteps rang behind her, unhurried, deliberate, closing the distance with the confidence of a man who had never once needed to hurry to get what he wanted. Delphine, Weston called down the hall, his voice honeyed with the old mockery. "Don't run from me, baby. It's embarrassing." She spun, searching the corridor for a door, a stairwell, anything, and found nothing but the stranger in the alcove and Weston rounding the corner behind her with seconds to spare. She didn't think. She simply moved, closing the distance to the stranger, fisting both hands into the lapels of a suit that had clearly cost more than her monthly rent, and pulled his mouth down to hers. She braced for him to shove her away. Instead, two enormous hands closed around her waist, not pushing, pulling, drawing her flush against a chest built like a seawall, and the kiss that was supposed to be nothing but camouflage caught fire in her hands. He tasted like good scotch and dark coffee. He took over instantly, his mouth angling against hers with an assurance that made her knees forget their job, one hand spreading wide and warm and unhurried over the curve of her hip, as though her body were something to be savored rather than endured. Somewhere past the roaring in her ears, footsteps slowed near the alcove, hesitated, and kept walking. She heard Weston mutter a curse to himself and continue down the hall, oblivious to the two people wrapped around each other 3 feet away. Delphine pulled back first, gasping, her lipstick smeared and her hands still shaking against his chest. "I am so sorry," she stammered, staring at his silk tie rather than his face. There was a man. My ex, he was following me, and I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. When he said nothing, she made herself look up, and the face she found looking down at her stopped every thought in her head. Sharp, aristocratic, carved out of something harder than marble. Dark stubble along a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes so deep brown they read as black in the low light. He wasn't angry. He looked amused, and beneath the amusement, something quieter and far more dangerous. "Is that so?" he said, his voice a low, unhurried rasp that moved through her like a struck match. Before she could apologize a second time, a sound froze her solid, the synchronized click of 6 safeties disengaging in the dark. Delphine turned her head and found 6 men in black suits stepping out from the shadow of an adjoining suite, every one of them aiming a silenced pistol directly at her. "Boss," one of them said, a broad-shouldered man with a scar splitting his eyebrow, "want me to handle her?" Delphine stopped breathing entirely. She looked back at the man she'd just kissed, and understanding landed on her like a physical blow. She had heard his name whispered once at a client dinner, spoken the way people speak about weather systems and federal indictments. Salvatore Ferraro. Heir to the only crime family south of Miami that mattered, a man who owned judges and dock permits, and half the waterfront real estate on the Florida coast, a man whose enemies didn't simply vanish, they were erased so thoroughly the city forgot to ask where they'd gone. And she had just used him as a human shield to hide from her ex. Sal lifted one gloved hand. The guns dropped and disappeared into shoulder holsters with the same synchronized precision they'd appeared with. And he looked back down at her, his gaze traveling slowly over the curve of her bare shoulders, the swell of her hips against burgundy silk, before settling, in no rush at all, back on her frightened eyes. Unlike Weston, whose stare had always made her feel like an inconvenience, Sal's was heavy and hungry and completely without judgment. "Stand down, Dante," he said quietly, never once looking away from her. The lady was only hiding. "I have to go," Delphine managed, her voice barely holding together, and she pulled free of his grip. He let her go instantly, his hands falling open at his sides, and she hitched up her skirt and ran back toward the noise and light of the ballroom without once looking back. If she had, she would have seen Salvatore Ferraro touch 2 fingers to his own mouth, a slow and dangerous smile spreading across his face as he watched her go. The name Ferraro meant something specific in that city, though Delphine wouldn't fully understand how specific until later. Salvatore had inherited an organization that ran half the freight moving through the port of Miami, an empire built on shipping manifests, quiet arrangements with harbor officials, and a reputation for surgical, unhesitating violence whenever a debt went unpaid. He was 34, dressed exclusively in bespoke Italian tailoring that did nothing to disguise the ink crawling up both forearms or the flat, assessing stillness he carried into every room. The stillness of a man who had learned young that the loudest person in a negotiation was usually the weakest one. Judges took his calls personally. Rival organizations up and down the coast had learned at considerable cost not to test how far his patience extended. For 8 years, he had run the family without once letting a woman close enough to matter, because in his experience, closeness was simply a longer, slower kind of vulnerability, and he had buried enough people he'd love to know exactly what it cost. Which was, Dante would say later, exactly why watching him chase a stray lipstick print halfway across the city for 3 straight days had been the strangest thing any of them had witnessed him do in a decade. 3 days crawled by. Delphine jumped at every shadow, double-checked her locks twice a night, and flinched at every black SUV idling too long outside her building in Edgewater. She told herself she was being paranoid about the Mafia boss part of the equation. A man who moved 9-figure shipping contracts through the port of Miami had no earthly reason to chase down a plus-size accountant who'd panic-kissed him in a hallway. To a man like that, she was 5 strange seconds of his week, nothing more. Her real fear, the one that actually kept her up, was Weston. Because Weston had figured out exactly where she'd been that night and exactly where she lived now. He called her phone 31 times in 3 days, voicemails swinging between sobbing apology and vicious threat, inside the same 60 seconds. He emailed her office account twice a day, long paragraphs that read like love letters until the last line always curdled into something uglier. On the second afternoon, a florist delivered a box of black roses to her desk with a card that read, "You can't hide that body from me forever." And Delphine had thrown up quietly in the office bathroom before going back to her desk and finishing her spreadsheets, because that was what she had always done, kept moving, kept functioning, kept the mask on. Her coworkers noticed she'd stopped eating lunch in the break room. Her manager asked twice if everything was all right at home, and both times Delphine had smiled and said fine, because admitting the truth out loud had always felt like handing Weston one more piece of her to use later. It was a wet Tuesday when it finally caught up to her. She left Caldereas late, the streets slick and neon-streaked, and let herself into the lobby of her building already thinking about takeout and a hot shower and nothing at all. "Hello, Piggy," a voice said from the sofa in the corner, and every ounce of warmth left her body at once. Weston was sitting there with a coffee cup in his hand like he owned the place, disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and manic in a way she'd learned to fear years ago. He stood blocking her path to the elevators. "How did you get in here?" she demanded, forcing steel into a voice that didn't feel steady at all. Weston, you need to leave or I will call the police." "Police?" he scoffed, stepping closer. "For what, talking to my fiancé?" "Ex-fiancé," Delphine snapped, backing toward the glass doors. "It has been 6 months. We are done." "When I say we're done," Weston roared, the calm cracking off him all at once, and he crossed the lobby and grabbed her upper arm hard enough that she felt his fingers find bone. "Let go of me," Delphine cried out, twisting against a grip that had always been stronger than hers, and Weston yanked her close, his breath sour with old beer, his eyes crawling over her body with open disgust. "You think you can do better than me?" he hissed. "Look at you. You're huge. Nobody else is ever going to want a body like that. I'm the only man who could stomach touching you. You belong to me." Old tears sprang up hot and humiliating, the same poison she'd swallowed for 3 straight years, and some small broken corner of her still believed every word of it, even as she hated herself for believing it. Let her go. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even a demand, more a fact being read aloud, and it dropped the temperature of the lobby by 10 degrees on its way across the marble. Weston froze, his grip still cutting into Delphine's arm, and turned toward the shadows by the mailboxes, where 3 men had materialized without a sound. Two were built like retaining walls in tailored black suits. The third, standing between them in an unbuttoned charcoal jacket with an unlit cigarette between two fingers, was the man from the corridor. Salvatore Ferraro looked almost bored, except for his eyes, which were locked on the exact spot where Weston's hand was bruising Delphine's arm. And in those eyes was a promise of something Weston clearly wasn't equipped to survive. "Who the hell are you?" Weston spat, puffing himself up, though his voice wavered. "This is private. Back off." Sal didn't so much as glance at him. He snapped two fingers, one crisp sound, and the scarred man from the corridor, Dante, crossed the lobby in a blur and closed his hand around Weston's wrist, the one buried in Delphine's arm, and twisted. The crack that followed echoed off the marble like a gunshot, and Weston went down screaming, cradling a wrist bent at an angle wrists don't bend, sobbing before he even hit the floor. Delphine stumbled back against the cold wall, staring in horror at the man writhing at her feet, and then up at the men who had broken him without raising their voices. Sal crossed the lobby slowly, his shoes clicking against marble like a metronome, and stepped directly over Weston as though he were a stain on the rug rather than a person, stopping only when he stood in front of her. Up close he smelled like bergamot and good scotch, and something darker underneath both. He reached out and Delphine flinched hard, eyes shut, bracing. Instead, she felt the shocking gentleness of his knuckles brushing a tear off her cheek. "Open your eyes," he murmured. And she did, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her knees genuinely unsteady. "He called you huge," Sal said quietly, his gaze dropping to take in the shape of her under her damp coat. "Said nobody would want you." Delphine looked away, shame burning hotter than fear. "Please, just let me go upstairs. Don't hurt me." Sal stepped closer instead, close enough that his chest brushed hers, and cupped her jaw in one warm hand, tilting her face back up. "Hurt you," he repeated, a low laugh moving through his chest. "You used a Mafia boss as a human shield and then ran from him. You tasted like fear and champagne, and I have spent 3 days tearing this city apart looking for the woman who stole something from me without knowing she'd taken it." His thumb dragged slowly across her bottom lip. "Now that I've found you, I intend to show you exactly how much a man can want every inch of what you're carrying." Behind them, Weston moaned. Sal didn't look back. "Dante," he said, never taking his eyes off Delphine's stunned face, "take the trash outside, and if he comes within 10 miles of my woman again, take the other hand too. If her quiet strength has you hooked already, subscribe and stay with her." The trip from her rain-soaked lobby to a penthouse on Fisher Island felt like something out of a fever dream. Delphine hadn't packed a bag or even locked her own front door. Sal had simply wrapped his cashmere overcoat around her shaking shoulders and walked her into the back of a bulletproof Maybach. And now sunlight was pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows onto a bedroom bigger than her entire apartment. And she was sitting on the edge of a silk-sheeted bed, staring at a tray of untouched pastries a silent housekeeper had left behind. "You haven't eaten," Sal said from the doorway. He'd shed the jacket and tie, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms roped with muscle and dense with ink. Tattoos that clashed hard against the billionaire polish of the room, a reminder of exactly what had built it. "I'm not hungry," Delphine lied, wrapping her arms around her stomach. An old defensive habit Weston had trained into her without her ever noticing. "Mr. Ferraro, I can't stay here. I have a job. I have a life." Sal crossed the room and stopped between her knees, reaching down to peel her arms gently away from her middle. "You're hiding again," he said. "I told you last night, no one in my house will ever make you feel like you need to shrink." He knelt in front of her without a thought for his slacks, his hands settling warm and reverent over her thighs. "Small men do this," he said. "They try to break down anything with real weight to it. Your body is a fact worth worshipping, not a flaw you owe anyone an apology for. Delphine's breath caught, a tear sliding free before she could stop it. For 3 years, she'd been told her body was a burden she owed someone an apology for. Now the most dangerous man in the state was on his knees in front of her, looking at her thighs like they were something sacred. He leaned in and pressed a slow kiss to the curve of her stomach through the silk of a borrowed robe, and a sob broke loose from her chest at the sheer tenderness of a man who broke wrists for a living. "I bought you a few things," Sal said, standing and pulling her up with easy strength, guiding her toward a walk-in closet that turned out to be stocked floor to ceiling with tailored gowns cut specifically to flatter every inch of her, wide-fit heels that wouldn't punish her feet, and a velvet box on the center island holding a diamond necklace that could have paid off her mortgage twice. "This is too much," she whispered. "I'm an accountant, Sal." "You're mine," he corrected, sliding his arms around her from behind and pressing his mouth to her neck. "And the woman who stands beside the head of the Ferraro family wears exactly what she wants. Get dressed. Tonight we're going to Solene, and I want the whole city to see you on my arm." What Sal didn't tell her not yet was the storm already gathering underneath the gifts and the gold. 2 floors down in the guarded basement office, Dante laid a folder on the desk. "The Cabrera outfit knows about the girl boss," he said. "They know you brought her here." Sal poured 2 fingers of scotch, his face settling into something flat and clinical. "How?" he asked. "Her ex," Dante said. "Weston Cole's in $500,000 deep to Tommy Cabrera on sports betting he can't cover. When we broke his wrist in that lobby, he ran straight to Tommy and sold her out, told him she's your new weakness." The glass in Sal's hand shattered. "Weakness," he repeated softly, blood and scotch dripping onto the rug, a smile spreading across his face that had nothing warm left in it. Tommy Cabrera thinks my woman is a weakness." He wrapped a handkerchief around his bleeding palm without looking at it. "Double the perimeter, and get me everything we have on Calder Reyes's shipping contracts with Tommy's fish import fronts tonight." What Sal hadn't counted on was that Delphine was already looking. The next morning, she found herself alone in his study while he took calls downstairs, and rather than sit idle, she'd pulled a stack of his organization's shipping manifests off the desk out of pure habit. The same restless competence that made her excellent at her actual job, and started cross-referencing invoice numbers against customs codes without really thinking about why. The numbers didn't add up the way legitimate freight numbers usually did, and once Delphine noticed a pattern, she had never in her life been able to leave it alone. She built 3 columns in the margin of a legal pad, checked them twice, and was halfway through a 4th when Sal's study door opened behind her. "Your logistics guy has been routing 15% of your Miami freight through a shell company called Palmas Seafood," she said before he could ask what she was doing with his private files. "And Palmas Seafood shares a filing address with a company that also processes betting markers for Tommy Cabrera's book. Your ex-fiancé's gambling debt and your rival's shipping front are sitting inside the same 3 invoices, which means Weston didn't stumble onto Cabrera by accident. Cabrera's people have had a hook in your freight operation for months." Sal crossed the room slowly and looked down at the legal pad, then back up at her. Something shifting behind his eyes that wasn't hunger this time. It was closer to awe. "You just found in one morning what I've paid 3 accountants 2 months to miss," he said quietly. Delphine lifted her chin, curvy and unbothered, and for the first time all week, completely sure of herself. "I'm very good at my job," she said, "and I don't like sloppy numbers, they're rude." Sal laughed, a real laugh, low and startled out of him, and braced both hands on the desk on either side of her, leaning in close enough that she felt his breath against her jaw before he stopped himself, some old discipline pulling him back a fraction of an inch. "Later," he said roughly, his eyes dark. "Right now I need every man I have on Palmas before Tommy Cabrera realizes what you just handed me." He kissed her once, hard and quick, like a promise he intended to keep. and was gone down the hallway barking orders before she'd fully caught her breath. The private dining room at Solene was a masterclass in restraint and money, but Delphine could barely focus on the 12-course tasting menu in front of her. She was too aware of the man across the table devastating in a midnight blue jacket, his hand finding her knee under the linen every few minutes, his eyes dropping again and again to the deep neckline of the emerald gown he'd chosen for her himself. Twice already he had leaned in close enough that she'd felt certain he was about to kiss her across the table, only for a waiter or a phone buzzing in his jacket to break the moment before it landed. And each near miss left her more aware of him than the last, the anticipation almost worse than the ambush that was already, unknown to either of them, minutes away. "You're quiet," Sal noted, turning his wine glass slowly. "I'm overwhelmed," Delphine admitted. 4 days ago, I was terrified of my own front door. Now I'm sitting here in a dress worth more than my car, having dinner with a man half the state answers to." She met his eyes. "Are you going to keep me, Sal? Like something on a shelf? Am I a pet to you?" The playful edge dropped clean off his face, replaced with something searing and unguarded. "You're not a pet," he said. "You are the only thing in my life that's ever felt clean. If you want to walk out that door right now, I will put you in a car with $10 million and never contact you again. But if you stay as my equal, as my Donna." Before Delphine could even begin to absorb the size of that offer, the heavy doors of the private room blew open. 3 men in leather jackets stormed in with automatic weapons already raised, and Sal moved before her brain had finished registering the sound, flipping the heavy oak table upright and driving her to the floor beneath the shelter of his own body. Gunfire tore through the room, crystal exploding, plaster raining from the ceiling, the whole elegant space collapsing into noise and smoke in the space of a single breath. Delphine screamed into his chest with her hands clamped over her ears, while he didn't so much as flinch, a wall of muscle and tailored wool between her and every bullet in the room, one arm braced over her head, the other already reaching for the pistol holstered at his ribs. From the hallway, Dante and 4 more of Sal's men returned fire in a hard, disciplined burst that lasted less than 30 seconds. All 3 of Cabrera's shooters hit the floor and stayed there. The silence afterward was worse than the noise, thick with cordite and plaster dust and the acrid smell of scorched wood. And Sal hauled Delphine up and ran his hands over her fast and frantic, checking every inch of her for blood that wasn't there. "Talk to me," he said. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," she managed through chattering teeth. "I'm okay." And she meant it more than she expected to. Some new steadiness under the fear that hadn't been there 4 days ago. "Bring him in," Sal barked over his shoulder, and Dante dragged a bloody sobbing figure into the wreckage of the dining room. It was Weston, missing a shoe, his broken wrist wrapped in a filthy sling, weeping openly, the manic bravado he'd carried into that hotel lobby a week ago, completely gone, replaced by a man who understood exactly how small he was in a room like this one. "Delphine, please, they made me do it. The Cabreras said they'd kill me if I didn't give up where you were," he babbled, dragging himself half upright on his knees. "I never wanted anything to happen to you, baby. I still love you. You know that." Delphine looked down at the man who had spent 3 years convincing her she was lucky to be tolerated, now on his knees in broken glass, begging the woman he used to call fat and pathetic to save his life, and felt nothing but a clean, quiet disgust, the kind that finally, blessedly, had no fear tangled up inside it anymore. Sal drew a pistol from his shoulder holster, cocked it, and pressed the barrel flat against Weston's forehead. "You sold what belongs to me," he said, and the total absence of heat in his voice was worse than any shout could have been. "Give me one reason I shouldn't paint this floor with you." "Sal, wait," Delphine said. He froze instantly, Though the gun stayed level, his eyes cutting to her while every man in the room went rigid with disbelief that anyone would interrupt him mid-execution. Delphine stepped around the ruined table, glass crunching under her heels, and looked down at Weston, who gazed back up at her with pathetic, hopeful eyes, certain she was about to save him. "You told me for 3 years that I was nothing without you," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her more than anyone else in the room. "You told me my body was something to apologize for, that no one else would ever want it, that I should be grateful you were willing to look at me at all. And look at you now. On your knees in a stranger's blood, begging the fat, pathetic woman you always said would never survive without you to save your life. You sold me to a rival family to cover a gambling debt because you were too much of a coward to face your own consequences. You're not dangerous, Weston. You never were. You are a coward, and you always will be." She turned to Sal, looked at the gun in his hand, the blood on the marble, the entire violent kingdom he ruled without apology, and understood with total clarity that she had never once been afraid of his darkness, because his darkness existed for one reason only: to keep hers safe. She reached out and pushed his gun arm gently down toward the floor. "Not in here," she said. "It'll ruin my dress." Sal's breath caught audibly. A slow, proud, wicked smile spread across his face like she'd just handed him the entire world in one sentence. "Dante," he said, never once taking his eyes off her, "take Mr. Cole to the docks. Make sure he understands exactly what his debts cost from now on." Back at the penthouse, long after Weston's screaming had faded down the hallway and the city outside had gone dark and glittering below the windows, Delphine found Sal sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands actually shaking, a sight she doubted anyone else alive had ever been allowed to see. She sat beside him without a word, and for a while neither of them said anything, the adrenaline of the night draining out of both of them at different speeds. "I've watched you for over a year," he admitted quietly, before she'd even asked. "Calder Reyes has held our shipping contract since last spring, and I used to find reasons to sit in on meetings I had no business attending just to hear you argue with my own logistics team about tariff codes. My own men used to joke that the boss suddenly cared very deeply about customs paperwork. I told myself it was business. It was never business." He looked up at her, something raw and unguarded in his face for the first time since she'd met him. "That first month, I told myself I'd introduce myself properly, at a real dinner, somewhere that had nothing to do with freight or ledgers. I never did it. Every week, I told myself there'd be time, and every week I found a reason it wasn't the right one, because everything I touch in this life ends up buried or bleeding, and you looked like the one clean thing left in this city, and some coward in me didn't want to be the one who ruined that. That night in the corridor wasn't luck, Delphine. I'd have found a reason to be near you eventually. You just got there first, and I have never once regretted a single second of it." Delphine sat beside him, her hand covering his where it had gone white-knuckled against the sheets. "I spent 3 years being told I should be grateful for scraps," she said quietly. "I am so tired of shrinking myself down to fit inside someone else's comfort, tired of apologizing for a body that has never once failed me. I don't want to hide anymore, Sal. Not from Weston. Not from Tommy Cabrera. Not from you. Not from any of it." She turned his face toward hers with one hand. "That look you had in the hallway before you even knew my name wasn't contempt. I know contempt. I lived with it for 3 years. What you looked at me with was something you'd been swallowing for a long time." Sal turned his hand over to lace his fingers through hers, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the kind of silence that says more than either of them had words for yet. Then he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, slow and reverent, like a man swearing an oath in the only language he trusted, before pulling her fully into his arms and holding on like a man who had finally stopped bracing for the ground to disappear beneath him. 3 weeks later, the city of Miami watched Salvatore Ferraro walk into a fundraiser at the Windemere. with a curvy, radiant woman on his arm, and no attempt whatsoever to explain her away. Tommy Cabrera's operation had been quietly, thoroughly dismantled within the week, his Tres Palmas front seized down to the paperwork, thanks to a set of numbers one forensic accountant had laid out with surgical precision, and word moved fast through the underworld that the new Donna of the Ferraro family wasn't a trophy on anyone's arm. She was the reason half the family's freight suddenly ran clean. Delphine kept her job at Calder Reyes because nobody, not even the most dangerous man on the coast, was going to be the reason she gave up something she'd built herself. And when a junior partner made the mistake of suggesting gently that perhaps she should consider a quieter role now, Delphine had simply looked at him until he found something urgent to do at his own desk. "Never again," Sal murmured against her lips as the cameras flashed outside the Windemere, and his men formed a quiet, watchful ring around them both, close enough to guard, far enough to give the moment room to breathe. "You are the Donna of this city now, and I will burn it to the ground before I let anyone ever again make you feel small in it." She kissed him back. Curves pressed against the hard line of him, unhurried and certain, and let the warmth of the man who had chosen every inch of her erase whatever was left of the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. Somewhere behind them, a photographer's flash caught the two of them exactly as they were, curvy and dangerous, and entirely unbothered by anyone's opinion of either. And the picture ran the next morning under a headline that called her simply, "The woman Salvatore Ferraro finally couldn't live without." She thought sometimes in the quiet after about the version of herself who had walked into that ballroom 4 weeks ago braced to disappear, who had spent years believing that taking up less space was the price of being loved. That version of her had grabbed a stranger in a dark hallway out of pure terror, expecting to be shoved away, expecting one more man to tell her exactly how much of herself she needed to apologize for. Instead, she had found a man who looked at every soft, unhidden inch of her and called it a kingdom worth ruling. She had not shrunk to be chosen. She had simply finally stopped hiding, and the whole dangerous, glittering city had rearranged itself around her instead. Subscribe now because a new story like hers arrives again tomorrow night.